Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our second Emerging Civil War in Conversation Live. Today we have James Cosgrove with Project Past. So we're going to be talking a little bit, just like we did last week, about top five Civil War places, events, and monuments. But before we kind of kick things off with that, I wanted to ask you, James, kind of about your Civil War origin story. Everyone kind of has that entry point right into history or into the Civil War. So what was yours?
Well, it's probably very similar. You've probably heard this 100 times, and you probably already know what I'm about to say. But as a kid, my dad just happened to pop in Gettysburg. He pulled out the two box VHS set, popped it in the VCR, and think about being 5 or 6 years old, you're bouncing off the walls. I was glued to it, and from then on, I've been hooked on all things Civil War. And after watching Gettysburg, I would go outside and defend Little Round Top, and then during the 90s, a lot of war movies came out, of course, Gettysburg, and then you had Saving Private Ryan, The Patriot, and all these back to back. So it's just like I was living in my glory. And Civil War combat on the History Channel, Battlefield Detectives. It was what a time to be alive.
Yeah, no, I mean I can relate to that. Yeah, I always say my kind of origin story had three parts. Like I picked up randomly this brochure of Gettysburg and kind of
Mhm.
threw it, and then watching the movie, that was the second part. And yeah, like you said, I was just glued, and I remember I think wearing out parts of the VHS a little bit.
Oh, yeah. We used to have to like switch tapes, and then then went to DVD, and then Gods and Generals came out, and so it was just like an endless supply of content. And then my parents aren't watching, so I can say this, but I used to pretend I was sick anytime Civil War combat was on TV. So it's like, you get the TV guide and you look at the paper. It's like, okay, on Wednesday, the History Channel is running Civil War combat marathon. So, I got the flu that day. So I would be home all day and just watch that. And, it just stuck with me ever since I was a kid. I've always loved military history. And then, yeah, so here we are today.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I see our friend Estella from uh,
Stella.
Pennsylvania is watching. So
Yeah.
she's a friend of Emerging Civil War and American Battlefield Trust. So it's great to see your face here.
Ken,
So
how
if
you
we,
doing?
yeah, Ken, yep, yeah. Uh, if we're talking about kind of after you got into Civil War history and everything, after you saw the movie, then what was kind of your next like? Well, I guess what was the first battlefield that you got to visit?
So my first battlefield I went to was actually Yorktown during spring break. God, maybe I was in eighth grade. While all my friends were, going on family vacations to the beach. I'm from Florida, so it's like I go to the beach anytime I want. So like, my mom was like, "Oh, I'm going to take some time off work. Like, what do you want to do?" And at the time, the Patriot was really big. So American Revolution, it was very in my face. So I was like, I'm going to go to Yorktown. So we took a road trip to Yorktown, spent 3 or 4 days there, hit Williamsburg and Jamestown. And so that was like my first exposure to going to a battlefield and seeing a place that I read about in history books. Now, being in eighth grade, you don't fully understand the significance of that ground. You're walking on ground where people lost their lives and where our country was literally being fought for. But it was just such an eye-opening experience. And like I said, like it just kept that fire burning all through middle school and high school, while you chase girls. But I was always like, yeah, Yorktown was pretty cool.
Yeah, no,
But
for sure.
yeah, it's just that was my first battlefield. And I had the opportunity to go back, gosh, 3 4 years ago. And it's everything I remembered. It was just amazing.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely, for those that have been on the battlefield, I think there's kind of that, compelling or kind of moving experience, right? On standing, being able to stand on hallowed ground and see also kind of just see where, these great events, right, in American history took
Oh,
place.
absolutely. I
And
never understood people that like math. It's like you can read something in a history book and then go where it happened. Like math, you're
yeah,
just like somehow there's letters in it. Like I just don't trust it.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
My graduate advisor always said I became a historian because I'm bad at math. Right, math is not my thing. So yeah,
Right.
you can definitely have that emotional connection, right, with it.
Oh,
At least I don't
absolutely.
have with math. So
No, 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 not at all.
Yeah. Great. So in that kind of going with that theme, what would you say your top 5 historical places are, or places that have to do with Civil War history?
That I've been to?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Gosh. Well, I mean, not to sound cheesy or generic, but I think Gettysburg is in a class of its own. And I think people don't realize how special that place is. You hear all the time Gettysburg is the gateway into the American Civil War. Well, for a lot of like my exposure as a kid, Gettysburg was the first thing I watched. Gettysburg is all I knew until I started Project Pass and going to different places. But when you go to Gettysburg, the battlefield is pristine. And then you have the interpretation. The interpretation of that battlefield is second to none. Going to a lot of other battlefields, you don't get regimental markers and brigade tablets and flank markers and national park signage, especially the new signage. It's fantastic. So it's so special there. Um, and of course, watching the movie as a kid and then finally being able to walk that ground, it was a very neat experience. So Gettysburg by far is in a league of its own. It's hard to even say it's number one. I can even take my wife and daughter there and they absolutely love it. It's just, like I said, just a special place. The next battlefield, gosh, I guess I've been to Manassas once, and that's where the Civil War really started, and I think that's where a lot of people started realizing that this isn't fun and games. This is real. People are going to die. This isn't going to last 15 minutes like everyone thinks it is. And I think that was a huge wake up call to the nation. Of course, after that you had Shiloh, which was an even bigger wake up call, and Balls Bluff was a disaster. But I feel like a lot of people realize that this is not a game. So I feel like Manassas was a really good one to hit. And also, one of my favorite regiments of the Civil War fought at Manassas, and that's really the only combat they saw, the 11th New York Fire Zouaves,
Yeah.
they were led by Colonel Elmer Ellsworth before he was killed, but um, they were recruited predominantly from New York fire departments. So as our the New York Fire Department. So me being a firefighter, it was an easy connection to research that and go down the rabbit hole of that unit. And they were involved in, I believe it's the Marshall House Inn, where they ascended the stairs, cut the flag, and that's where Ellsworth was killed by the innkeeper. So they had a very turbulent beginning there. And then at Manassas, they fought right where the visitor center is now, trying to recapture Griffin and Ricketts batteries. And they made several charges up Henry Hill. And I believe they were with the 14th Brooklyn and maybe even the 1st Minnesota, along with
Mhm.
the 69th New York. And, together they even helped recapture the colors of the 69th New York. And, so being able to walk that ground, they had Francis Brownell's uniform in the visitor center. So seeing a Fire Zouave uniform there, that was really cool. So that would be my number two, I guess. Chickamauga is probably my favorite battlefield to visit outside of Gettysburg, only because I don't know. I don't know. I just really, really enjoyed it. Just the sheer size of it. And then it was just pure chaos. And, not to, um, obviously emerging civil war is a huge part of my research. So reading bushwhacking on a grand scale, that really helped me paint the picture of that battlefield. I actually met the author of it. I think Lee White is his name. He's a ranger there. So being able to talk with him with the book and, walk the ground, it really helped piece things together for me. And I really enjoyed my time there. Um, the vineyard field on the southern end of the battlefield at Chickamauga, it reminds me a lot of Gettysburg's wheat field. You have farmland surrounded by woods, and just the fighting itself, that back and forth ebb and flow, pulling in units, chewing them up and spitting them out. Actually, Hood's division was involved in that area really a month and a half after Gettysburg. So I really like that portion of Chickamauga, that southern end vineyard field there. The 6th Florida was involved there. They made a charge, tried to capture some Union guns. They were exposed all alone and got chewed up pretty good. Wilder's Lightning Brigade was in that area, mounted infantry. Pretty much they were infantry that rode into battle on horseback. So Chickamauga is a very cool battlefield. Gosh, was that 3? See, I told you math's not my strength.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
that's 3. Yeah.
I saw someone just bring up Shiloh. Shiloh is a fantastic battlefield. Um, I'd have to close it out with Shiloh and Antietam, just because, like I said, Gettysburg's in a class of his own, but I feel like the preservation of Shiloh and Antietam are in a class of their own. You can go to those battlefields and not see any modern intrusions. Whereas Gettysburg, you have the town itself, and then you also have, like a KFC as you're, kind of walking down Pickett's Charge, and some of that stuff's being corrected. But as far as like preservation and seeing almost what the soldiers saw, I think Antietam and Shiloh are two of the best for that. So I think that's five.
I think that's five too. Yeah, and it's great
Yeah,
choices too. Yeah,
yeah.
I've not been to Chickamauga, but that's definitely on
Oh,
my bucket list.
highly recommend it. It's
Yeah.
it's. I feel like it's one of those that it's closest to Gettysburg as far as like the sheer size and like the how ferocious the fighting was. And then
Mhm.
I'll throw out an honorable mention, Alusty. Can't forget
Yeah.
Alusty.
Yeah, yeah,
So
I've not been there too, which, what
yeah,
I think that's the biggest battle in Florida, right?
yeah, biggest
Okay.
and deadliest. It's not this massive grand battle. Really about 5,000 men on each side. The Union got mauled there. They lost, I believe, like 35% of their force. So you think you walk in with 5,000 men, you're almost half of those men aren't leaving the field. One out of every three, essentially. Like going back to the interpretation of Gettysburg, how special it is at Alusty, you don't have any of that. You don't have regimental markers, and you have a battlefield trail with some signage on it, really good signage, pretty descriptive, but you don't have like the flank markers and the brigade tablets. So you're trying to piece it together. But it is a very nice battlefield to go to.
That's cool. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
unique too, right? That's probably
very.
not on everyone's top 5 list, so
It is, and
cool.
it's one of the more forgotten places. There's people in Florida that don't even know about it.
Yeah, wow. Um, Sweet, okay, so now what about your top 5 Civil War events?
Oh boy. Well, I guess to start, firing on Fort Sumter to kick things off.
Yeah,
Some people say that that's where that was the turning point of the war. I guess you can say. Even firing on the Star of the West, it showed that before that was in January of
I think so.
'61. That showed that the Confederates were for real. Like they were like, hey, we're not just doing this to showboat. Like we don't want to be a part of this anymore. We want to
Yeah,
do our own thing. So I guess you can loop those two together. Going back to Manassas, first Manassas really kind of kicked things off. The first major battle. Again, this isn't us dressing up in fancy uniforms and marching down the street and getting kisses from the neighborhood girls and all that. This is real. Like a lot
yeah,
of us aren't coming home, kind of thing. And you learned a lot about the ineptitude of some of the leadership in place. Um, I guess Shiloh was another one that really, I believe up until that point, that was the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, Shiloh. Um, Again, one of those, just a massive battle. Both sides were just absolutely mauled. And it really set the stage for, you think about if Grant wouldn't have been, he removed from command, and if he never got back into the picture, how do things turn out then?
yeah,
Maybe Buell arrives a day late or something. I know what ifs are kind of, you can do that with anything, but so I think that early fighting Shiloh represented again like this is not. Yeah, it's even worse than Manassas. So as the time's going, these battles are getting worse and worse. Um, Events maybe Lee taking command
mm,
of making it the Army of Northern Virginia. You think about how close the Union was to the doorstep of Richmond, and then Joe Johnston gets hit, and then Lee takes command, and then think about what happens after that. You have the 7 days, but think about how long it takes the Union to even get that close to Richmond.
yeah,
And the revolving door that Lee creates with the Army of the Potomac, leadership wise, how long that prolonged the war. I think that was a pretty major event. Was that three? God, this math thing, I'm telling you, man. Three, four. Gosh. Of course, I think Gettysburg, maybe not necessarily a turning point, but it showed people that the Army of the Potomac can defeat Lee. Because up until that point, they've been embarrassed on numerous occasions. I mean, Antietam, you can say, they won, but that was really a tie when you look
mhm,
at it. So I think Gettysburg is more like a moral victory. Obviously, it was a tactical, strategic victory for the Union, but I think it showed Lee or Lincoln was probably like, okay, I finally got a guy in place who can fight Lee, who isn't going to fall into his traps, who's maybe one step ahead of Lee. It seemed like so. I think that was a huge moment. Vicksburg, kind of sealed off what was left of the Mississippi for the Confederates. You can loop that and Gettysburg together. 1864, I think, was a pretty important year. Think about Grant taking command of both armies, and now you have the West and the East working in conjunction together as opposed to just kind of doing their own thing. It's an election year. So, if Lincoln doesn't get elected, what does this country look like? Reelected, I should say. So I think that's five. So I think those are just come to mind. Those
Yeah.
those five major events that kind of woke people up as far as the ferocity of this war, and then turning points, I guess you can say.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how could you leave Gettysburg off? I mean, in addition
Yeah.
to being such a you know, a memorable place, right? Or a
Mhm.
place that I think both you and I kind of have a personal connection to. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, there's debate whether it was, the turning point or a turning point, but
Yeah.
I definitely agree. I think it's, significant in how, the soldiers felt that they could, finally win right
Oh
against
yeah.
the
I mean,
Confederate Army.
think about what it was what, a month and a half removed from Chancellorsville, which
Yeah,
most of the Union Army was embarrassed there. It wasn't, the Confederates still suffered a lot of casualties at Chancellorsville. It wasn't just overwhelming victory, but still, it was just like, God, he got us again and
yeah,
again and again, and now we're fighting on our soil. If he gets us again, what happens?
right.
And they ended up persevering. But yeah, I think maybe not necessarily a turning point, like you said, but a huge, like, all right, hey, we can do this.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah, and
reignited the fire a bit.
even Lee taking command, I've always said, how cool would it have been to be in the room? I forget what meeting or what house he kind of had his first council of war in, but just
Mhm.
that kind of tangible, cultural shift. I mean, anyone who's kind of been in the corporate world or anything, I think, getting new leadership is of course significant, right? But um, just Lee kind of coming in and kind of taking the reins. Yeah, I think that's a moment that sometimes doesn't get as much attention as it should.
Yeah, and I think some don't even realize that Lee wasn't even in command up until that point.
Yeah,
Even think about it in easier terms. Think of like your favorite football team has a terrible year. They fire the coach. He brings in a new culture and a new playbook, and all of a sudden now they're doing flank maneuvers, and the other team's like, wait, what is going on? So yeah, I think it was that the 7 days, all of a sudden he started punching McClellan in the face, essentially beating him back. And then, no one else knew, like everyone was so afraid, like, is he going to appear on my flank randomly? It's like, yeah,
yeah,
probably.
yeah,
So, it just like what he did to the whole Army of the Potomac, just put them on skates essentially.
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully that success happens to the Steelers next year after.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll
Yeah,
see.
yeah, really. Um, cool, cool. So, how about James? How about your top five favorite monuments, Civil War monuments?
Oh, all right. Well, let me think here. I think the first one that comes to mind, going back to Gettysburg, I love the 73rd New York monument. And I guess it's right next to the peach orchard. But on top of it, you have a Union soldier next to a New York City fireman. Obviously, like I said, my connection to the fire service, being a firefighter, I was driving up to Gettysburg and I was like, is that a firefighter up there? And every time I go there now, that's usually my first stop, unless I get in at 10 o'clock at night. But it's usually my first stop, just learning about the Excelsior Brigade, and just learning about how these guys were serving their country in one capacity, set down their fire hoses and axes, and picked up a musket, and then they got mauled in the peach orchard there. So that's my favorite monument of all time. My second would be on McPherson's Ridge, or McPherson's Ridge, however you want to pronounce it, the 80th New York.
Hmm.
Just because I learned I guess about a year and a half ago now, I had an ancestor in the 80th New York.
Oh, cool.
20th New York State Militia. They went by both. The Ulster Guard. Patrick Jordan, he was in Company F, I believe. Somehow survived the war. He was at Antietam, Fredericksburg, went through Gettysburg, and then he went to the Invalid Reserve Corps in, I believe, the winter of '63. And then lived out the rest of his days. But he was there at Gettysburg, and just being able to not only walk the ground that you read about, but walk the ground that you had a family member on, and they survived. And it's pretty powerful experience. And then I was able to take my family back there with my daughter. We placed a flag there, so it was kind of like a full circle moment for me. It's one of those things I've always wanted to do. So that monument's pretty special to me. Let's see, favorite monument. I love the Florida. It's not. I guess it's not a monument to a regiment, but it's the Florida Monument at Chickamauga. Beautiful. I think it was in the American Battlefield Trust calendar. Maybe been the cover.
Okay.
But it's right near the visitor center, and that's where Breckinridge's division came through on the 20th, in the morning of the 20th of September. And in his division was a mixed brigade, but there was 2 or 3 Florida regiments, one of them being the third Florida. They were consolidated, but that's where the Florida Monument is. It's amazing. The 6th Mississippi at Shiloh was really cool. Learning about their story in Ray Field again, and they were called the Bloody Six because they assaulted across this field, suffered 70-80% of casualties after multiple assaults. They were getting hit on their flank by Union artillery, and then the monument itself is just a beautiful monument. It shows a color bearer being shot, I believe, but just a nice tribute to them. Gosh, there's so many cool ones, and they all use a bit of symbolism. Was that 3? This is a lot harder than you think.
I know. Yeah, I was even trying to rack my own brain, like, can I come up with 5, or do I?
Yeah.
Are there more? Or
Trying
less?
not to go back to Gettysburg, but at the Slider Farm, it was one of the sharpshooter regiments. I don't remember the regiment name, but they have their monument, and there's a hornet's nest on top of the monument. And I believe a Confederate, it was a Texan. I don't know if it was an officer or not, but he described it as a perfect hornet's nest that they were walking into because of the rate of fire that the sharpshooters were putting out. That was a really cool monument. Usually at the Slider Farm, you have it to yourself. Not many people venture down there. God, I'm trying to pick another battlefield here.
Wow, Gettysburg is so rich with monuments, right?
It is.
Hard not to kind of gravitate away.
I know. Trying to think of an Antietam one. There's some really cool ones by the cornfield, of course. Like the Irish Brigade Monument at the Bloody Lane is really cool. They have it's like bronze or whatever, but they have like a moment from the unit advancing. I haven't been to Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville or any of the Wilderness or anything in that area. So I guess Antietam, we can close it out with the Irish Brigade Monument. It's a pretty cool one. Florida, again, gets a honorable mention at Gettysburg, but it's nothing special. It's just, a square piece of granite that says Florida, but as a Florida boy, you gotta at least have honorable mention.
Yeah. Shout out. Yeah. Right. Shout out to
David Lang.
Florida. Yeah.
Yeah.
So James, tell me more about your kind of ancestral connection to the Civil War. And if I understand correctly, you kind of found out about that after you got interested in history in the Civil War.
Yeah. So I even went to Gettysburg. So I probably found, let's start from the beginning. I created Project Past in 2021. Went to Gettysburg for the first time ever in 2022, right when they closed Little Round Top. Like I'm talking like I came 2 days after they closed it, which was fine because I was able to film and focus on other parts of the battlefield. But I had no idea I had an ancestor in the Union Army until I believe it was like around Christmas time of 23. I just happened, I was like, I'm going to try this ancestry thing. So I went in it and I started doing things and, piecing things together. And then Patrick Jordan popped up. And I was like, on ancestry.com, you can get yourself in trouble if you're not doing your due diligence. You're just hitting accept. You can put people in from other trees. So it popped up and it showed a Civil War service, 80th New York. I was like, oh my God, that's awesome. I was like, but I don't want to get too excited. So I called my grandma. I was like, hey, do we have like Jordans in our family? She goes, oh yeah, the Jordans, they're from, Kingston, New York, Ulster County. I was like, we had an ancestor that fought at Gettysburg. She was like, yeah, I think I remember that. I was like, you didn't ever think to tell me that? Like, I've only loved Gettysburg since I was 5.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I found that out. So like I said, I went to Gettysburg before I even knew that. So going back to Gettysburg, 4 or 5 times after knowing that, it's been that much more special to me. I don't know a whole lot about him. I don't have a picture of him. All I know is he enlisted when the regiment was first mustered. I believe, like I said, I think they were the 20th New York State Militia. They got redesignated the 80th New York, and then they all re-enlisted for. They changed their terms of enlistment, and then he was at places like Antietam near the cornfield. Just like in the worst of the worst. And again, I've been to Antietam a few times, had no idea he was there. And then, of course, Gettysburg. And then, like I said, he mustered out, went to the Veteran Reserve Corps, and I think the winter of '63. And then, lived out the rest of his days. But yeah, that's about the extent I know. Maybe there's more, maybe there's not. But so Patrick Jordan is, my personal connection.
So what was it like, bringing I think you mentioned your daughter, right, to
Yeah.
Gettysburg and kind of introducing her to this story? Because, I think having that family connection, there's really nothing else like it, right?
No, there isn't. And, like I said, I've been there multiple times. So going back, knowing that information, it was that much more special. And then I went back with my family who absolutely loved Gettysburg. My wife's a history teacher, but she's more like World War II, World War One
Mhm.
time period, but she appreciates the history. So, when we went back there, she fell in love with Gettysburg. My daughter loved it, the pumpkin patches and then going on Little Round Top, climbing on all the rocks and all that stuff. And um, you know, in my mind, I was like, I want to take them to the monument, a little bit of a full circle moment. So, taking them there, walking that ground, telling my wife a little bit about what happened there and, the significance of day one. And, having my daughter was so gung ho to place a flag there. She's 3. So, her attention span is 10 seconds, if that. That's a good day. So, just being able to like, hey, this is where our grandpapa fought. He fought right here. And she was like, okay. And then gave her a flag and she placed it. It was a very cool experience. I have it on video. I watch it intermittently. It's just,
Yeah.
it's just one of those special connections to history that you don't get with math.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure a memory that both you and her, you and she will have forever,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And that's something, when she's older and she, understands the significance of some of these things, she'll have more appreciation for it. But I definitely want to take her back again. And do the same thing, place a flag there, and kind of talk to her a little bit about what happened. Grandpapa was a soldier and all that. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was very cool.
Cool. Yeah. So how about what was kind of the impetus or the beginning? What inspired you to start Project Past, your YouTube channel?
So like I said, my love for military history never left me. My wife and I have been to a handful of battlefields, just on our own personal travels, and I would take pictures and video some stuff, go back, show my dad, and all that stuff. And um, COVID hit, so during everything was shut down. So my wife and I were like, she was my girlfriend at the time. We're like, let's when everything opens back up, let's do like a DC road trip. We'll start. Well, we live in St. Augustine, Florida. We'll start here, hit Savannah, Charleston, and kind of work our way up, and hit DC and then Richmond, and maybe hit the peninsula, Williamsburg, and all that. So I was doing research, and I came across it's a tiny channel. I probably never heard of it, the History Underground with JD.
Yeah.
Super small channel. But yeah, I came across his videos and he was doing like a DC series and some sites in DC. I was like, wow, it's really cool. I was showing my wife, and then he did like a DC like travel guide. And a couple of days later, I went back on, and one of his Band of Brothers videos when he went to Bastogne popped up, and just watching. Seeing those foxholes and growing up with Band of Brothers, watching that series, I was like, man, this is incredible. I told my wife, and she was like, you like history, you like filming and taking pictures. Like, why don't you do something? I was like, are you just trying to get me out of the house? Um, but I was like, oh no, I can't do that. Like this, like live chats and videoing, that is not me. That is not my comfort zone. So, after, she encouraged me like 3 or 4 times, come on, just do it. Just do it. Came up with the name, created the channel. I sat on it for like 2 months, didn't do anything. She went out of town. I was like, you know what? Like, I'm going to just go to a site. I had no direction. I had no idea what I was doing. I filmed an episode on my phone. I believe it was Fort Caroline was the first place I videoed, just outside of Jacksonville. It was a early French settlement in the 1560s, and right when the Spanish was landing in St. Augustine, and they would end up fighting each other. And but that was the first site I went to and made the video, and just from there I was like, even if no one watches it, like I enjoy doing this. So it kind of grew from there, and then the channel itself evolved into kind of what you see today. Like I think Gary Edelman said it best. If you want to learn about a battle, you start at the brigade and regimental level, and then go from there. So, going to Gettysburg, the gateway to the Civil War, I learned the structure of an army, and how many regiments are in a brigade, how many brigades in a division, divisions in a corps, and corps in an army, all that stuff. So, from then on, I kind of started focusing on the brigade level and down, just because, I feel like that's manageable as far as a video, and it's manageable from a learning standpoint, but it feels more real.
Hmm.
Like you have the personal stories, and, okay, the 73rd New York was standing right here, and, this private left this account, and this officer was killed, over here with the flag. And it just makes it that much more real. And that's where the channel kind of started evolving to, is more, you know, the Jimmies and the Joes, not so much, the upper echelon guys. So
Right.
that's where it is today.
That's sweet. Yeah, yeah. I remember. I think my favorite videos of yours is when you visited. I think Lieutenant or Captain Henry Fuller's
Yes.
the marker at Gettysburg, where he was, ultimately killed. Right.
Yeah,
It's
that was one of my favorite experiences.
yeah,
If you guys are going to trek down there, I don't recommend doing it in the summer like I did, because it used to be like an old trolley bed or something. Um, there was a trail off that. I could not find that. Everything was so overgrown. And I was like, you know what? Like, I was in the wheat field anyway. I was like, I'm just gonna follow his path, and kind of hit like that little Plum Creek in there, and found his marker. But yeah, that was the coolest experience, because if Gettysburg gets a million, they probably get more, but if they get a million visitors a year, maybe 100 people venture down there, maybe. So
yeah,
it's such a
that,
small percentage of people. Again, those are numbers I just made up for the ease of the conversation, but um, it's a monument that does not get a lot of attention. And Captain Henry Fuller was mortally wounded in that area. I think Private Whipple in the 64th New York tried to pick him up and carry him, and then I think Fuller was hit again, and then Whipple was captured. So yeah, finding that monument and spending some time there, I probably hung out there for like 20 minutes.
yeah,
Um, was a really cool experience. It's super easy to find in the winter. You can almost see it from the 17th Main stone wall. But yeah, that is, that connection to history. You're getting down to that individual level. I think the 27th Connecticut has a couple in the wheat field as well. Their commander, was it Merlin? Lieutenant
Merwin,
Colonel
I think.
Merlin?
Yeah,
Merwin. And then Captain Chapman,
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
by the 17th Main stone wall. So like I find those fascinating, that because people ask on the videos, like, why did they just put a monument to him? I was like, well, think about it. Like, they went back to the battlefield and placed a monument for that individual. That shows you what they thought of those people. They weren't just doing that just to do it. Then
yeah.
everyone would have one. So it shows you what the units thought of those individuals, and that makes it that much more special. So yeah, that,
Yeah,
that
and
was
even I mean, even their age, right? So I'm not sure how old Henry Fuller was, but even his brigade commander, John Rutter Brooke, I think was like 24 years old, which is
oh
I
yeah.
mean, I'm 26, and I can't imagine commanding a brigade, right, in the Civil War. It's just mind-boggling, you know.
Yeah, what we've asked our youth to do in all these conflicts
Yeah,
is something to not take lightly. And I think that's another reason why these battlefields are important. The people in those situations maybe can learn a thing or two from these battlefields, instead of being so eager to send people off to war. So it's one of those, like, look what we've asked our youth to do. Let's not forget,
yeah,
what these guys did.
for sure. Yeah, so I guess changing gears just slightly
Hmm.
before we wrap up. What are your you know, top five Civil War characters or individuals.
Characters. I really like. His time was cut short super early in the war. Elmer Ellsworth. Again,
Mm,
we touched on him in a little bit in the beginning. Um, Killed at the Marshall House and cutting that Confederate flag down in Alexandria. Got killed, but he was very. Lincoln looked at him in a very positive way. They were personal friends. I believe they studied law together in Illinois. Ellsworth devoted his early life to learning military tactics and manuals and became a drill master. So I, I, I wish we could have seen what he would have became in the war. Maybe he would have been killed at Bull Run instead of the Marshall House. But I feel like he had a very promising career ahead of him. And again, the men of the 11th New York elected him to lead them. So again, it kind of shows you what they thought. Um, I think John Bell Hood's an interesting character because I feel like he was a really competent brigade commander. And then, you know, he was always around the worst fighting. It seemed like if you were next to Hood, you were in like the worst place imaginable on earth. And I'm sure his men thought the same thing. I mean, think about what his men went through,
yeah.
the battles they went through. But I feel like he was a very competent brigade commander, and then for whatever reason, whether it's the injuries or he didn't shift his mindset to controlling when he became a division commander, and then commanded an army into Franklin, where I was obviously a disaster. Think about what he went through and the wounds that he received. Like he didn't receive these minor wounds. He got hit in the hip at Chickamauga. Like that's hard. If a soldier were to get shot in the hip today, that's a very hard wound to even stop the bleeding. So even with modern day technology, so think about the American Civil War. It's too high for a tourniquet. Like you're going to be bleeding in. Not to interject my civilian job into it, but you're going to be bleeding into your pelvis and things of that nature. So
Wow.
the fact that he came back from that shows you how tough he was. But also, like, I want to know if there was like a moment where like he just had no regard for his men's lives, or maybe he did. He was just so numb because of all the stuff he saw. So he's always an interesting one. Anytime I see something about him, I try to read it. Um, David Lang of the 8th Florida, I really like. Again, he doesn't have like a glorious story full of exploits, but he was just enlisted as a private in the 1st Florida when the war started. Worked his way up to sergeant, and then got mustered out, and then mustered back in as a captain for the 8th Florida Company C. Wounded at Antietam, Fredericksburg. I think he got hit by like a huge chunk of chimney in Fredericksburg. He was with the 8th Florida, pushed into the town of Fredericksburg to help oppose the landings or the crossings. And he got wounded there, got promoted to colonel of the 8th Florida, led the Florida Brigade at Gettysburg because Perry had typhoid fever. And the men loved him. Very competent brigade commander. And then finished out the rest of his years, led the Florida Brigade a few more times, and then went back to Florida, became a state representative, and helped streamline training for the National Guard and helped advocate for soldier pay for the Florida National, what would become the Florida National Guard. But just like guys like that, think about how many competent, hard charging brigade commanders on both sides that really made up these armies that, helped Lee and Grant succeed. But it was really these guys, the
Yeah.
Jimmies and the Joes. Um, Colonel Jesse Appler of the 53rd Ohio is an interesting one. He opposed the 6th Mississippi at Shiloh, the Bloody Six. We talked about their monument a little earlier. So he sent numerous warnings to Sherman was his division commander. Sent numerous warnings up the chain. They were all dismissed. I see Confederates, stop. Even Sherman told them, take your damn regiment back to Ohio. Stop. Like they're in Corinth. We're fine. Of course, they weren't. But on the morning of April 6th of 1862, when things started getting hot and heavy, they were camped in the middle of a field. Appler kind of positioned his regiment a few different ways because he would see Confederates in this wood line and then Confederates in that wood line. And then finally, he pushed him to a far wood line, which made the 6th Mississippi charge across an open field. They mauled the 6th Mississippi. And at some point, Appler broke and said, run for your lives. And the whole regiment just broke after repelling numerous Confederate attacks. So it's like I want to, know what happened to him, like he seemed very competent up until that point, positioned his regiment in a position of strength. They had clear fields of fire. They were mauling the 6th Mississippi, and then all with artillery support. And all of a sudden, he just cracked, and he was never the same. Got discharged out of the army after that.
Mm.
So I always, anytime I read something about Ray Field, I'm like, man, what happened? But everyone has, think about what these guys going back to their age, what we're asking them to do,
Yeah.
and what they're seeing, and maybe one of his friends took a mini ball to the face right next to him. Who knows? He's always a very interesting one. Emerson Updike is.
Mm.
I feel like he's kind of excuse my language, but a badass. I feel like Updike's Tigers, especially at Franklin, positioned his brigade kind of in a spot where they told him not to, and then ended up saving the Union line in the center. And again, a guy that was in the thick of some fighting and very competent. I think he belonged. Maybe is it the 125th Ohio he commanded before a
Mm.
brigade?
Okay.
So they were positioned on Snodgrass Hill at Chickamauga. Again, performed great. Yeah, and then when they charged into Franklin, I think he was like bashing Confederate soldiers over the head with the butt of his pistol. Like, again, this is just awful stuff that we're asking these people to do. Arthur MacArthur, I think, was in his brigade,
Mm.
who ended up he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Missionary Ridge. Grabbed the American flag and charged up Missionary Ridge, and then the rest of the 24th kind of followed up with them, and they ended up taking the ridge. So again, just these individual stories, or some of them are sad, like Appler's and Hood's. It's like, man, you were just sending your guys to die like nothing, like they weren't even there. Like, was he that numb? Did something happen? So it's
Yeah.
yeah, I would say those are my 5 that come to the top of my head first.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. I had no idea about that. The story of Appler. That's
Yeah,
crazy.
it's weird. Again, like I don't have all the specifics, but it seemed like he positioned his regiment in a good spot, and then the Confederates came, and I think the 6th Mississippi was joined by a Tennessee regiment and repelled them. And again, just at some point, he looked at his guys and said, run for your lives. Everyone broke. And then, it's like, what happened? And then he got discharged and never heard from him again. So,
Yeah, everyone has their breaking point, right? It's that that interesting like. I feel like we have casualties, right? Kill, wounded, or missing, but
Mhm.
that term can be loose, right? There are casualties, long-term casualties of the war. Psychological,
Oh, yeah.
and physical.
For sure. Like I said, imagine making a charge and your childhood friend is
Yeah,
next to you and he gets hit. You can't even stop to help him because you have to charge this objective. It's like that's combat is one thing, but then the psychological aspect after a battle, you got to bury all the enemies dead
yeah,
in these very awful, morbid conditions. It's that part of the war that you don't maybe put as much thought into as we should.
yeah, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. So, lastly, before we kind of finish up, right? Um, emerging Civil War is all about unique perspectives on the Civil War. So, I'm curious, James, how your kind of day job, right, as a firefighter and a paramedic, I believe, correct?
Yep.
How does that kind of influence your interpretation of history and of the Civil War?
Well, so the fire service is steeped in history and tradition, and firefighters hate 2 things: the way things are and change. So, and I think you can apply that to the American Civil War. You had, that the old guard way of thinking, for even just like military wise. You had these old style tactics, and the weapons are beginning to outpace those tactics. And you didn't really see a change in the military doctrine until later in the war, where armies were now digging in and defending positions as opposed to just making senseless frontal assaults. I mean, they still happen, but you can kind of apply it to that. Like I said, firefighters, there's always new technology. It's like, oh, just put water on it. You don't need to, bank it off this, or put this type of hose and this type of nozzle. And then, you can imagine during the American Civil War, generals like, no, we're just going to assault that position. It's like, well, no, they're dug in, with artillery here. It's like, no, it's fine. It's fine. This is how it's going to work. So it's like kind of one of those, sometimes change is good, and you can adapt to the changing technologies and use them to your advantage, as opposed to having such a closed mind to things. And even the way of thinking for our country before and after. um, and you can think about, you had a more agrarian society, farming society in the South, and up north is more industrialized. It seems like one side, you know, there were just two different polar opposites, and there was no compromise. So I think some of those lessons, we can apply today. It's like, hey, we have to be able to talk to each other and change and adapt. And there's change is good. It's not always a bad thing. If we never change, we would still be making fires with two rocks and some dry grass.
Yeah,
It's so I guess you can apply, um, you know, the whole change and adapt thing to the American Civil War.
for sure. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, speaking of change, before the Civil War, you have 4 million people right in bondage, and after that,
Mhm.
you know, one of the most probably significant inflection points, at least I think in American history, emancipation.
Yes,
It's kind of
and even
the country navigating that. So
yeah, and even just because they weren't in bondage anymore, the adversity was really only beginning. It wasn't
yeah,
until literally 100 years later that they had to still fight for civil rights.
yeah,
So it was a huge American Civil War is our nation's defining moment. You can say that our country was born during the American Revolution, but I think it became the United States in 1865 after the American Civil War ended. Or at
yeah,
least it started to become the United States, you can say. Because like I said, you had the women's suffrage movement, and then civil rights, basic human right things that, we look at today. It's like, what were you guys thinking? Like, this is easy stuff to change. But
yeah,
during that time, it's a huge thing. They have a way of thinking, and they won't deviate from it. And you ended up having a war that killed almost 1 million people.
yeah,
So
yeah. Now, what about your, kind of your experience in the medical field, and do you find yourself kind of gravitating towards some medical history and kind of, how I'm curious kind of how you interpret, the Civil War and military history through that particular lens.
yeah, I mean, we talked about it a little bit, learning about John Bell Hood's wound, like in the upper hip. And as I'm at Chickamauga, I'm like, man, like, how did he survive this? Like, there's methods to occlude that type of bleeding today. And of course, we have antibiotics for infection and things of that nature. But that's a very hard wound to not only survive, but just thrive afterwards. Like to live and still fight a war. That's a, it's not an easy wound to come back from. And I think a lot of people don't realize, people see the pictures and a stack of legs that were sawed off. I think people think that that's the extent of Civil War medicine, when in reality some huge strides were made, not only from a surgical standpoint, but think about like the ambulance corps itself and how it evolved, and getting guys from the front to field hospitals and things of that nature. It seems rudimentary today, but those were huge milestones for the American Civil War. And you had early anesthesia that they weren't just sawing legs off with guys screaming awake. They would sedate them to some extent, and maybe a little too much, because then you had a lot of veterans after the war that were dependent on that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think it's a little more complex, or a little more advanced than we like to think, and it's always interesting to learn about, because something as simple as a tourniquet still saves lives today. That's like the number one thing to, especially I was in the army for 6 years as a medic, and first thing, someone's hit and you put on a tourniquet on their limb. Obviously, you don't put one on if they're hitting the trunk, but people were still bleeding out from extremity hemorrhage in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is, again, looking at it now is inexcusable. But when you something as simple as a tourniquet and you neglect that, like, that it really saves lives. And think about how many men lives were saved from something as simple as that. And
yeah.
again, it seems rudimentary today, but it was a lot more advanced than we like to give credit to some of those things.
No, for sure. Yeah, it kind of gives a new perspective, and I think it almost kind of like you can empathize a little bit more with them because they're not, in some cases, the 1860s were a very different time, right? But in other
Mhm.
cases, they weren't that, it wasn't that long ago, it wasn't that far away from where we are now.
Yeah, and also think about the type of projectiles they were dealing with. You know, a mini ball is compared to today's rounds, it's so slow moving. It's not even like piercing. It's like just essentially punching its way through your body. Whereas a round today is like piercing and traveling so fast that sometimes it even cauterizes some of the wounds, you know, and some of the vessels. Like, and then, I'm almost like imagine being hit by a softball. Like that's like a mini ball hitting you and just shattering and just ripping. It's not even like piercing through things. So it was just awful wounds that they were presented with.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff.
It really is.
But well, thank you again, James, for chatting for a little bit in our kind of new series here in Conversation Live. Make sure you guys check out James's YouTube channel, Project Past. Like I said, he's got a lot of great content on there as well as on History Fix, I believe. So
Yep, yep. Thank you for having me. You know, Emerging Civil War is usually my go-to when it comes to doing research, and the Emerging Civil War book series is second to none. It's by far my favorite series. It's like the perfect blend of simplifying the battle, but yet you're still getting like high level details. So yeah, just when you guys asked me to come on, I was honored. So thank you for having me. Thank you for your
yeah,
time, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
yeah, that would be great. Yeah, thank you again, James. Like I said, make sure you check out Emerging Civil War, the blog. We have new content almost every single day on there. We'll probably be doing a few more of these live conversations, so make sure you tune in for those. And otherwise, we will see everyone online and on the battlefield.